Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back, and in this tutorial we're going to be talking about the editor. The editor, and in fact the outliner as well, they're kind of a pair. This is probably where you're going to be spending most of your time in GeoPix. So there's a lot to talk about here, and this will be a longer video, so if you want to jump around and find something specific, check out the timecode chapter bookmarks in the comments or down in the scrub bar below. But essentially this is going to be a conversation about all the different tools we have and the things that are available up here. I'm going to try and stay away from the object specific topics as much as possible, though we'll dive into a few as is necessary to explain these. But really I just want to walk you through what all of these things do and how they work, and we'll talk about when to use certain things and when not to use certain things, and we'll hopefully get you up to speed with how to navigate and work this viewport from here. So okay, first thing to discuss is navigation. Navigation is pretty straightforward in GeoPix. It's alt based, which means you need to be holding your alt key on your keyboard. This is really designed so that your left hand is kind of in and around the left side of your keyboard and the mouse is going to be doing all of the actual heavy lifting outside of that. So if you're holding alt, and you can see we have a little panel down here in the bottom left that tells you what's being pressed. This might be helpful as we move through this tutorial to know if I have any hotkeys or things like that pressed. But alt is down, and when you have alt down, all you really need to do is just drag your left mouse around the screen to rotate, and you can use the right mouse button with alt pressed to move the camera, and then the middle mouse drag to zoom. And you can also use your mouse wheel to zoom. So that's very much all there is to navigation. When you don't have alt pressed, you're not going to be moving the camera. The only thing that can move the camera, the only two things are keyframes, or if you home your object, right? Home to a certain selection. So if you press F on your keyboard, it's going to kind of reset your camera to whatever it is you have selected. We don't have anything selected, so it's just kind of taking us to the center of the viewport. But we'll talk about F here again in a moment. Okay, so if we go up to our view screen right here, we're going to actually talk about frame now. So we have frame selected and reset camera. So let's go ahead and create an object that we can simply work with. So by the way, to create something, go to the Create tab. This is going to open the Create dialog, Objects, All. Make sure you click on those, and then you should be greeted with this menu here. So I'm just going to make a primitive, which is going to give us a cube. And once we've got that cube, we can now go back to our View menu, and we can work with that. And by the way, if your cube's not selected, you can just click on it in the outliner. So if it's deselected, just click here, and you'll be good to go. So View. Click on View, and we have these top two things. So frame selected, which we just did a second ago. It took us to the center of our grid. We're going to do that now, and you'll notice that it homes us to our cube, which is quite useful. You will be using this a lot, and anytime you feel like your camera is just kind of wonked out and not working correctly. So for example, sometimes this happens where you're over here working on something, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I want to get back to my cube, but it's so far away. And maybe you try zooming and you run out of zoom, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's moving so slow. This happens a lot in 3D, and you'll find yourself running into this frequently. And that's why the frame option exists. You want to press this anytime you want to basically move the camera to a new point of interest. Honestly, this is a big part of my camera navigation. If I just zoom out and I find the object I want, and maybe it's like way over here, right? And I'm like, okay, I want to come to this cube. I'll press F on the keyboard, and now all of my zoom and rotation and panning will just pretty much work with this object in mind. And if I want to jump back over here, use the F key to get there, and then navigate. And this is pretty straightforward. It's common knowledge if you're coming from the 3D world, which is where I originally come from with my own experience. But I want to make this hopefully as much of a primer for those of you without 3D experience as possible, without getting too into the nitty gritty. If you're new to 3D and you really want to learn some more, Blender is a great tool to explore this in. And while the control scheme is not exactly the same, a lot of the same principles apply. So Anyways, that's basically the home tool. Another thing that might happen sometimes is your camera will just get super messed up, and then maybe it's not responding. You're zooming in and out, nothing works. Usually the home key will fix this, but if you want to take the camera back to how it starts in GeoPix, you can just click reset camera, and that's going to take you back to this this view with your grid centered and sort of a 3/4 view. Okay, so that's basically it for the camera. One last thing, actually I lied, there's one more thing to mention. If you select camera in the outliner, this will actually select the camera. You can't select this in the viewport because you are the camera, but if you have an outside button, you can open this up. And you'll notice that as we navigate, these transform values are moving, and that's because we are moving the camera. But you can also go in here and you can adjust the camera's position, if you want to dial in a very specific shot. And you will find that this becomes very, very important when you are doing keyframe animation and stuff like that. So we'll talk about this in another video, but this is where you access your keyframes for TX, TY, TZ. And so you would position your camera, you'd be like, okay, this is going to be frame 1, and you would keyframe all this stuff, and then you would move the slider and you would find a new spot and you would keyframe that. So anyways, keyframing, its own video, but just wanted to show you that. Also in the camera is the perspective FOV. So if you're working with a project where you need to see more, kind of like the human eye does, you might want to drag the field of view up. You can only go up as high as 90 degrees, but that gives you quite a wide view. And this might also be a little distracting. It just depends, right, on what you're working on. Like certain types of cameras with, like if you're using a camera with like lots of zoom, it'll look more like this. Whereas if you're using a wide angle lens, it's going to look more like this. So again, field of view, very, very common. Every single 3 software out there has this attribute. So feel free to tweak that if you need. Okay. Also, yeah, near and far clip exist here as well. So if your scene is just too big or even too small, you can adjust these to bring in and dial in your clip planes, which will make things a little bit easier to see. Or if they're disappearing when you zoom out, you're going to need a bigger far clip. And if they're disappearing when you're zooming in, let me show you real quick. You'll notice that I'm cutting into my cube right now, and I can actually see inside of it. This can actually be useful sometimes, but if this is undesirable or if it's just happening too early, you can actually change this near clip to something like 1, right? And you can get in there even closer. So it just depends on the scale of your scene. This is usually pretty good if you're working in real world units. Real world units in GeoPix, is 1 gray square is a meter, but you're welcome to break that too if you don't care about units. So, okay, moving on, we have our select menu here. We have a few things with the camera, which we've already selected our camera. You can do that via the outliner, but you can also do it from this menu. So if you have nothing selected, you can select the camera. You can also select your render engine, which is going to bring up your lighting settings. This will be a video all on its own as well, so let's not really dwell on that too much. And then down below that, we have some hierarchical selection things, which are, these are pretty descriptive if you just read them, but I want to go ahead and show you how they work anyways, just to be clear. So I'm going to go ahead and take this cube and do some stuff with it. You don't have to worry too much about what I'm doing in terms of hotkeys. We'll come back to this, but pretty much just making 3 cubes side by side. I'm going to group these cubes so they are attached to a group, and we'll go ahead and move these down a bit, and we'll group it one more time. And we'll move the second group down. So what I've basically done is we have 3 cubes, right? These 3 cubes are parented to this object, and this object is parented to this object. And over here in the outliner, you can kind of see how this is more visualized here. This is what the outliner is for. We have group 1 parented to group 2, and we have primitives 1 through 3 parented to group 1. And if we rotate this, you'll see that we have the whole group rotating with it. So, all right, without getting kind of distracted here, we go through the select menu. The top one here, control up, is going to take us from our current selection to the parent object. So if we have these cubes selected and we click select parents, we're going to notice that we went from having our cube selected to our parent selected. And if we do this again, it's going to take us up to group 2, and group 2 doesn't have a parent, right? It's basically in the world, in the root of the world. So if we go to select and select parents, it's going to tell us no parent objects to select. What's cool about this is we can also go back down to the children. So and these have hotkeys, control up and control down. I highly recommend using those instead of the menu, but for the sake of display, I'm just showing you this here. So we can go back down, right? So going from group 2 to group 1. And if we do this again, if we select children, we'll go from group 1 to all 3 primitives. And the cool thing about selecting the children is it will select all of the children. So this is very useful if you have a lot of objects in a organized hierarchy, because you can, take that single group object at the top and you can just control down twice and you'll get all 3 primitives, and then you can go tweak those as needed. Maybe set the color or whatever it might be. So, okay. So that's selecting up and down. You also have select all, which is very self-explanatory. If you are translating objects, by the way, be careful with this, because if you select all, you're going to get double transforms. So you also have select none or deselect all, which is going to just clear your selection. And you also have invert selection, right? So if you have one object selected and you invert that, you're going to get everything else that is not selected. Okay, and then there's the Create tab, which we talked a bit about this, but essentially we have categories over here on the left, and then subcategories, and then once you have basically drilled down to your target category, you'll have stuff that you can click on over here. So these are collections, right? So geometry is a collection. There'll be more in the future. And each of these are kind of collection subcategories. These are actually folders on your computer. So you can go over here and modify these in the GeoPix directory, add your own files, reorganize it if you want. It's up to you. And then if you hover over these, you'll actually see the actual preview over here, and you can move around this little viewer if you want. And these things can be created, just dropped into your scene. So for example, here is a simple truss. Let's go ahead and create a new file real quick. So if we go to geometry, simple truss, we can make our truss object here. And this is very, very much just a simple 3D model of a truss. And then we can create the joining block as well, right? And we can put these together, and there we go. So that's the create menu. You can get to this by hitting Shift A, right? So Shift A on your keyboard is going to open this up. And if you know the name, or at least some partial string in the name, you can start typing, right? So if I type in truss, we automatically filter down to the truss objects we just created. And what's really cool about this is it takes everything into account, right? Everything in objects, geometry, everything. So let's say we want to make a fixture, and we know we want to make that object, but we don't want to go find it every single time. So if we simply do Shift A and we type in fixture, well, we get 2 objects, and because 2 things contain the name fixture, and we can just click on the one that we want to make. In this case, fixture, right? Another thing that we can do though, and let's try a name that's a little bit more specific, like generator. So you'll notice that we typed in generator. It filtered it down to just one object. And if you're down to one object, you can press enter. It's going to create that for you. So if you filter it down to one object, enter will automatically create it. So this allows you to navigate the create menu without even using your mouse in some cases, which can be very fast. So if I just type in tree, we got all the trees that we need. That's in the file. Of course, this takes away your preview, so this is not there. That might be something I add back in the future, but just keep in mind that the filter will filter it down to just what you are typing. Okay, so object. If we talk about this menu here, this will be correlated to what you see over here on the left too, right? So we have our select, marquee, move, rotate, scale, and snap tool. And over here we have those same ones as well, plus a few extras. So yeah, let's just start at the top here, and we'll actually kind of expand on some of these things that we've been using throughout this video so far. So select tool, if you have that, it's your default. This is very straightforward. You're just basically selecting things. Let me go ahead and duplicate this a few times. All right, so we have 4 truss objects. If we just have select mode and we click on these, it's basically just updating the selection, right? And if we hold shift, we're going to be adding to that selection. If we hold control, it's going to deselect the clicked object from our selection. And if we click something again, it just overwrites it, right? So that's how selection works. And that's what happens when you're in the select tool. And by the way, the outliner is a little different in this regard. If you click on objects here, you select them all the same. If you hold shift, you're actually selecting a chunk, right? So you're selecting everything from here to here. And this is very useful if you have like 50 or 25 objects and you want to select everything without clicking a bunch of times. The outliner is one of the ways to do that quickly. And then of course, if you hold control, you can still deselect things in the outliner. Okay, that is basic selection, and this kind of pertains to selection, so I'm going to cover this as well. And to do this next thing, I'm going to group these into a group. All right, so let's go move these down so we can see our hierarchy a little more clearly. So another thing in the outliner that we have is these icons. You might have noticed these, and these show up for objects that have a certain parameter. So for a truss or any object really, you have a visibility parameter. So you can turn this off and on, and you'll notice that this icon over here actually turns off as well. So you can go in here and you can turn off the visibility a little more quickly for all of these objects. But this goes a little bit further and deeper. If you have a hierarchy like this, again, another reason to leverage this whenever possible, if you hold control, you're actually going to turn off that entire hierarchy. And if you hold control while clicking it again, you'll turn it on. So this is useful because if you have, say, a couple objects visible, you can just control click off, back on, and you've just turned on everything in that hierarchy again. And this goes as deep as you have, right? So if I have another object parented to truss, let's go ahead and move this off into the side. All right, so we have this little hierarchy, and maybe this one's invisible. If we toggle the group, and the group doesn't even have to be expanded, it's going to kind of enable all of those for you by default. So using hierarchies is just very, very, very helpful. So, okay, we've talked about that. I just wanted to get that out of the way because that's a very useful thing. Control P, I will unparent these. And unparent these, and let's get rid of the group. All right, so moving on, we have our Marquee tool. So Marquee tool, let's go ahead and select that. I actually deselect first, and then we'll go into Marquee tool. When you're in Marquee mode, you can't click on things traditionally, right? You can't just select them, but you can still do that in the outliner if you want. But when you're in Marquee mode, you just click and drag a box, and it's basically your box selection mode. You'll notice that this is actually selecting the icon, so the geometry doesn't have any effect. The only thing that has an effect is the icon. So what you're actually marquee selecting is the origin of the object. So marquee select, when you're in this mode, is basically in add mode. So it's like if you're holding shift with select, right? So you can just, without even touching the keyboard, just kind of grab extra things. You can hold control and remove things. That's still an option. But your default mode is add. And if you hold control in the outliner, you can deselect some things, or you can select them and overwrite them. So there's lots of ways to mix and match the outliner and the viewport for this tool. So this is very useful for, especially useful for marquee selecting like pixels with fixtures and stuff like that, where you have lots of little points and you want to select just some, but it comes in handy sometimes for objects as well. All right, so moving on to the transform tools. Now I've been moving things around a lot in this video, and now I'm going to tell you kind of how that works. So let's go ahead and position our truss in the center of our grid. I'm going to home my camera just to kind of reset things, and if we go to the move tool, it's going to give us a transform gizmo, right? We have 3 colors, and they correspond to the axis of the object. So X is red, and green is Y, and blue is Z. So the first thing about this, as you can see, you just click and drag on the arrows. If you're in the middle of a drag with the left mouse, you can actually right click and it's going to reset your transform back to where it was before you started that particular drag. So if you accidentally move something a little bit, you can just right click and it will put it back. These squares will allow you to move things on a plane. So when you click, the screen one, it's basically saying I want to move it on X and Z, on the plane defined by X and Z. So you can just move things around and it's not going to move vertically. It's just going to move on X and Z. It's a little easier to see when you're at a slanted angle like this. So if I move this around, I'm just kind of scooting this around on this grid, right? So that's very useful, especially when, positioning legs on a table or something like that that's needs to be kind of constrained to a plane. Okay, so we have the rotate tool next, and this is very, very straightforward. You're just rotating on each of these different planes or lines, and you can also see that it's controlling these parameters here. So this is a local rotate. All right, so if we go to the scale tool next, you have a similar schema as the transform, so you can scale on 2 axes at once, or you can scale on 1 axis at once, and it's really up to you. It depends what you're doing. The middle here is going to do a uniform scale, but it's going to apply that to all 3 scale parameters. You also have this new uniform scale parameter, which is kind of a simple way to adjust the uniform scale here without having to adjust 3 different sliders, but just know that the scale tool itself only interacts with the scale X, Y, and Z. Okay, so moving on, we've got the snap tool, and to talk about this, I want to actually create a more simple object here. Let's make a cube, and let's duplicate this cube twice, or just once rather, and we'll scale this one down a bit, like that. Okay, so the cube is here. We got 2 of them, and if we go into our snap tool mode, you'll notice that we get some orange spheres that pop up on our object. So this is basically how the tool works. You click on any orange dot and you drag it to any other orange dot, and the things that you have selected will move by that increment. So let's go ahead and select our fixture 2 here, and if I drag from this dot over to this dot, it's going to basically join these up at that vertice. What's cool about the snap tool is you don't actually have to snap between 2 different objects. You can snap between 2 dots on the same object, and you can pretty much just like kind of hop things over one increment at a time. You'll also notice that we have the origin of our objects as a snap point, and this is because by default all objects have this enabled. So if you actually go into your parameters here, you'll notice that we have a snapping category. And in this snapping category, we have pivot snapping, right, which is going to basically turn off that center snap for that specific object. And we also have vertex snapping. And when you import a heavy object, this is going to be basically disabled by default. Because that's a lot of snapping points and it can kind of slow the system down. Okay, so over here in the review, I'll show you a few other snapping options. We have grid snapping, origin snapping, vertex snapping, hole snapping, and pick snapping. And so by default, the middle 3 are on. And so if you want to turn off all of your vertex snapping for everything without having to go through every object, you can just do that here and you'll snap origins only. You can also turn on grid snapping, so you're going to snap to the 1 meter per grid snapping coordinates, and that kind of helps out there. So lots of different options for different ways to snap things. So that is snapping in a nutshell. Below that we have delete, which is of course tied to the delete key. So if you have an object, you can just hit delete and it'll delete it. Down below that we have parent. So if we have 2 objects and we select one and then shift select, you can actually select as many as you want. So if we have multiple objects here and we select both of those, and the last one we select, that will be our parent in this operation. So if you go to object and the parent, we've now made the last selected object the parent of all the other ones that we have selected first. So if we move this around, we're going to bring those objects with us. So that's how that works. You can also unparent by just dragging them into the outliner graph, or you can also Control P, which will unparent that object as well. So if you have multiple objects, you can just hit Control P, and as you see here, they got deselected or deparented. So that is the parenting and unparenting in the object menu. Okay, moving on, you'll notice that there's a menu here called Geometry that keeps showing up and disappearing. And what this menu is about, and there's lots like it, this one here is specific to objects because we have a geometry object selected, but this is going to give us a context-based menu, right? So if we open up the geometry materials browser, it's going to basically do the initial refresh, and then we are presented with a bunch of swatches. And we'll talk about objects and materials and all that in a different video, but this is a tool that is specific to geometry objects. So if we have a fixture object, you'll notice that we have a fixture drop down here. And if we click on that, we have a bunch of tools that pertain to fixtures. And if we select both of these, we get both of these, right? Now our options change based on how many things we have selected. And so it kind of just varies. The best way to get the most options is to just select that one object by itself because it's the least constrained way of showing this context. But yeah, some objects are going to have these context menus. You just have to click on things and see what they have. So for example, a generator will have its own set of options as well. And those options will show up even on objects that are not generators, but you have to have at least one generator selected. So, okay, so those are the context-based menus, and that just about sums up this view. The one last thing that we'll mention here is this little gizmo for the axis up here, so you can kind of just get an idea of where your grid lines are pointing. This is actually quite useful in the context of a new scene because you don't necessarily know which way is front and back, right? TZ is generally the front to back. I would think of it that way anyways. X is side to side, and Y is of course up and down. You can break that and do whatever you want, but that's how it's designed to be thought of. But yeah, these gizmos, so the stick with the circle on the end is basically your positive axis. So Z going to the left is positive, and going back here towards the darker circle is the negative axis. And then the same is true with X. So this is positive, and vertical is positive. And if you ever get confused about that, just remember that up is always positive for Y, and that's your reference for which way is positive on that little gizmo. And what's cool about this is you can actually click on these too. So if you click on Z, for example, it's going to take you into an orthographic mode. And this is the only way to get into the orthographic mode at the moment. And it's a bit of a special mode because, as you can see, you can translate things more easily on a plane. You can also use the center object and the transform, and it's going to only transform it on that plane. So that's very useful. You can also notice there's a message that popped up over here, which is a warning that's just telling you all lighting and volumetric effects will be temporarily disabled because they don't work in orthographic mode. So to get back into your standard 3D mode, all you have to do is Alt and left click to drag. And you can basically go back to moving around your viewer as so. So that about sums it up. We've gone through the top bar here and all the different menus. We've gone through navigation, and we'll talk about the actual specific objects and some of their more detailed usages in a separate video. But for this video, I really just want to show you how to navigate this interface. And that's it. Stay tuned for the next one. Thanks a lot.